So feel free to type the questions in the Q&A box or the poll or the chat box. I'm sorry, the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll be answering those at the end. So without further ado, Sara, you want to take over?
So hi, thank you, Jen. So like Jen said, I'm Sara, and I'm the Kupu member serving at DAR's Ballast Water and Biofouling program. And today I'm going to be presenting about ballast water and biofouling as a major vector for marine introductions. So in this presentation, we are going to go over some background information and an introduction into what aquatic invasive species, or AIS, is. Then we're going to go over some of the top marine non-native species in Hawaii. So that's going to be ballast water and biofouling, and some examples of marine introduced species with ballast water and biofouling as a vector. And then go over some of the current Hawaii ballast water and ballast water regulations and an overview of the ballast water and biofouling program. Then we're going to go over some of the best management practices and some projects our team has worked on. And we'll end talking about the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, or VITA. So invasive species are species that are both not native to Hawaii and harmful to the environment, economy, and are to human health. So the difference between non-native versus invasive species is that non-native species are just introduced to Hawaii, whereas invasive species are introduced and have some type of negative impact. So this impact could be that they outcompete natives, threaten biodiversity, or impact tourism. So here are some examples of aquatic invasive species that are found throughout the Hawaiian Islands. So it was found that 463 introduced and cryptogenic marine and estuarine species were established in Hawaii on Hawaiian waters, according to Coulter and Eldridge 2015. However, this number has been undoubtedly underestimated. It was also found that 346 introduced and cryptogenic algae and invertebrate species were introduced through vessels. This being through ballast water and hull fouling, or biofouling. So ballast water and biofouling is responsible for about 78% of marine algae and invertebrate species introductions in Hawaii. Other vectors could be through aquarium release, aquaculture, or intentional releases. So what is ballast water? Ballast water is the water used to provide stability in the absence of or in addition to cargo weight, and displaces water equal to its own weight. So as cargo gets loaded off ships, ships take in water to compensate for the unloaded weight, and as cargo gets loaded on, it releases that ballast water, or discharges. So planktonic organisms can then be transported through ballast water and released into different areas where the ballast water is discharged. Within ballast water, there are ballast water sediments, which is particulate matter suspended in the water column and settles out. And this is likely to be organic and inorganic detritus and plankton. Hull fouling, or biofouling, is organisms stuck on the surfaces of vessel hulls, and these are likely to be intertidal and subtidal invertebrates, and they are transported on ship hulls to different places. So now we're going to go over some of the more notorious examples of aquatic invasive species with ballast water and biofouling as a vector. So first up is the upside-down jellyfish. It is native to the Indo-Pacific region, but found throughout some of the main Hawaiian islands. It was unintentionally introduced through both hull fouling in the juvenile benthic stage and ballast water in their pelagic stage, and they're a major nuisance in Hawaii because they can sting people. So next is the orange keyhole sponge, and it is native to Australia, but found in some of the main harbors, such as Honolulu Harbor, Barbers Point, Pearl Harbor, Kaneohe Bay, and Ke'ehi Lagoon. It is most likely introduced unintentionally as fouling on ship hulls, and they compete for space with native sponges and coral species. And in Kaneohe Bay, it is found to be overgrowing the coral on patch reefs, especially Parietes compressa. So lastly is prickly seaweed, and it's well established on all Hawaiian islands. It was unintentionally transported by ballast water or hull fouling and spreads through fragmentation. They negatively impact the ecosystem by outcompeting native algae and coral, and they grow over coral, shading it from sunlight. So now we're going to go over chapters 13-76 of the Hawaii Strait Administrative Rules, which authorizes DLNR to collect ballast water. However, this does not apply if the master determines it is unsafe to conduct a ballast water management practice. So this could be through the safety of crew or passengers, adverse weather, vessel design limitations, or equipment failure. So as part of the regulations, vessels must submit a ballast water reporting form 24 hours prior to arrival. This form must be accurate and fully filled out, and vessels must have all records on board, and the vessels must also have a ballast water management plan. Also, vessels must either treat their ballast water, and this can be through an onboard treatment, which is a properly functioning treatment system approved by the U.S. Coast Guard and designed to kill all living organisms in the ballast water. Freshwater, which is any form of municipal water supply from the US or Canada, or seal tanks, which are tanks incapable of discharging ballast water. Vessels could also conduct a mid-ocean exchange, which needs to be done 200 nautical miles off any coast, and this exchange could be through flow-through exchange, empty refill exchange, or any other USCG approved method. Or vessels can retain all ballast water on board, meaning that they won't discharge. So if a mid-ocean exchange needs to be done, empty refill exchange, which is when all the water is pumped out of the ballast tanks and completely refilled to the previous level, or flow-through method, which is when the ballast water pumps are turned on and the tanks are allowed to be overflowed from the ballast vents for a time that equals 2 to 3 volumes of the tanks, can be used. So the mission of this program is to control and minimize the spread of aquatic invasive species early on. So this can be done through collaboration and working with the maritime industry, local community, scientists, government, and stakeholders to develop solutions to prevent alien species introductions, prevention, which is done through conducting ballast water and vessel biofouling risk assessments, implementing regulations, and working to improve vessel compliance, detection, and documenting the prevalence and spread of aquatic invasive species to inform rapid response, control, and eradication efforts, and outreach to provide information to local community and to create involvement in opportunities to protect Hawaii's valuable aquatic resources. So as I said before, under the Hawaii State Administrative Rules, vessels must submit a ballast water reporting form 24 hours to arrival at any Hawaiian port. So this report provides us the information used to perform a primary assessment to review and assess possible risks. Next, a quantitative assessment is done, and all vessel arrival is stored on this Excel. Discharging information is also put through the quantitative assessment, and this assessment prioritizes vessels for boarding. So vessels with a higher risk can then be boarded for inspection, and this is where ballast water biosecurity risk assessments are conducted in coordination with the US Coast Guard. We can also check documentation and sample the ballast water. Some of the best management practices for ballast water are don't ballast in global hotspots, and this is because there can be toxic algae blooms or waterborne diseases in the area. You also don't want to ballast in a high sediment load because this can increase your ballast water sediments. And you don't want to ballast in areas near sewage discharge as it may contain harmful organisms. You also don't want to ballast at night due to diel vertical migration, but you do want to ballast in open waters in depths greater than 200 meters. So even though Hawaii currently has no biofouling regulations, our team is still working to identify the best available technology and best management practices for managing biofouling. We are also working to develop inspection and enforcement procedures for underwater biofouling inspections. And we can also monitor coral reefs and commercial harbors to detect and quantify the spread of aquatic invasive species. So this is a handout we developed with the Western Regional Panel for Recreational Boats. So some practices that can be done to reduce hull fouling is applying anti-fouling coating on the surface of your hulls. You could also clean your hull frequently and before departing to a new location, because this can reduce the spread of aquatic invasive species and increase your fuel efficiency because you won't have organisms on your hull to create drag. Going hand in hand with the previous booklet is boat maintenance and making sure a hull is clean with the appropriate paint. And then lastly, having a plan for managing the biofouling on your boat and having a logbook of your biofouling treatments and paint expiration dates. So in order for vessels to keep their hull free of biofouling is the need to clean their hull, and this can be done through in-water cleaning. So in-water cleaning is the cleaning of ships in the water between dry dock intervals to reduce biofouling. And this consists of the scraping, brushing, or blasting off of biofouling. However, this practice is a concern because it can release viable organisms into the water, and organisms like sponges, tunicates, and algae can regrow from those fragments. Also, paint components from anti-fouling coatings can be released into the water. So currently, in-water cleaning is restricted in Hawaii. However, this will soon change due to VETA. However, there's a new technology available that uses the in-water approach, but provides recovery of removed materials as well as seawater. So basically, it prevents discharge from being released into the surrounding waters. So here's an example of how we can manage biofouling. A vessel was brought to Hawaii from the mainland that had accumulated over 30 years of biofouling. Since there is no biofouling regulations, prior to their departure from the mainland, we advised the shipping company to clean their hull and niche areas. They ended up voluntarily cleaning their hull and reduced biofouling from 30 centimeters thick to 1 millimeter thick. After arriving in Hawaii, the shipping company consented to a voluntary hull survey, and the ballast water and biofouling team, along with NOAA, visually inspected the hull and niche areas for live macrofouling. They found, like in the picture shown here, that the hull was cleaned as reported, and majority of what was left was just the calcareous remains of bivalves and tube worms. However, there were still some live organisms that were found and removed and given to Bishop Museum for taxonomic and genetic analysis. So a current project that is being worked on is the Autonomous Reef Monitoring Structure, or as we call it, ARMS, Harbor Monitoring Project. In 2018, DAR deployed 20 ARMS units inside 5 commercial harbors and adjacent reefs in the state of Hawaii. So harbors were studied because this is where vessel traffic is the highest, and majority of marine introductions are related to vessel operations. So the goals of this project were to build species checklists and database so we know what species are present in the harbors. Also to build a voucher collection and DNA barcode reference library for Hawaii marine invertebrates with a focus on aquatic invasive species, and to identify new records of species. So the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, or VETA, is a federal statute that creates federal regulations for discharges incidental to the normal operation of vessels and takes authority away from states. So it requires the EPA to set national standards of performance for discharges incidental to the normal operation of a vessel, and requires the U.S. Coast Guard to set regulations for implementation, compliance, and enforcement of the EPA standards of performance by December 2022. The EPA has released the proposed national standards of performance, and DLNR provided comments. Currently, the EPA is finalizing regulations. The EPA proposed standards is an over 300-page document, but here are some of the main points and what they mean for our team. So first, it preempts states from regulating more stringent ballast water and biofouling rules. They also allow the cleaning of vessel hulls in state waters, which is currently restricted. It also allows states to enforce new U.S. Coast Guard regulations that will come into force December 2022. And they also prohibit states from charging shipping companies a fee to support this regulatory work. This means that there is no revenue to build a DAR team and is inconsistent across states. So at this time, we need to work together with all relevant agencies and interested parties to clarify and resolve some aspects of VITA before state regulations can be assessed and amended. Moving forward, it is important that we join forces and work together to stop the spread of invasive and to protect our precious aquatic resources for future generations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sara, for that insightful talk into ballast water and biofouling. And while we wait for some questions to pop up either in the chat or the Q&A box, I'd like to introduce Natalie Dunn. Natalie, if you want to turn your camera on. She works with the Division of Aquatic Resources in the Ballast Water and Biofouling department as well. So she's also here to answer some questions. I think I forgot to say at the beginning that Sara was or is a kupu placement with the Division of Aquatic Resources right now as well. So our first question in the chat is about how many vessel arrivals does Hawaii get each year?
So last year, 2020, we had about 825 vessels arriving to Hawaii. And out of those vessels, like about 50 of them were discharging. So that's when they go through the quantitative assessment. And then in the past years, in 2019, they had about like 900 vessels. And then prior to that, like about like 1,000.
That's the only question we have right now. Okay, another question just came in through the chat. Do we only need to worry about biofouling on commercial vessels?
Well, like I had that handout that was for recreational vessels. So we could, like, recreational vessels are important because like they go through like between states, so they could transfer aquatic invasive species between islands. So that could be like important too to like help manage. But right now, because there's like no regulations, like it is like really hard to like manage that.
Okay, and another question in the chat. Do you have an example of the worst introduced species to arrive in Hawaii via ballast water?
I'm not quite sure about the worst species. I don't know if Natalie, you know what the worst species is, or Jen, I don't know.
Yeah, historically, it's been difficult to tease apart the two different vectors between ballast water and biofouling. Previous studies have mostly relied on species traits based on likelihood of how they would be transported. If they have a larval stage, maybe they would be transported in ballast water. but if they're likely to attach to a hard substrate, then maybe more likely hull fouling. However, I'm not sure if this quite answers your question, but one thing that we're really concerned about right now is the stony coral tissue loss disease, which is in the Caribbean, Skittle D for short. And it's suggested that ballast water might be an important vector for transfer, since the spread in that region has gone sort of not in line with the oceanographic currents. And it just seems like ballast water is a potential vector for that. So that's what we're pretty concerned about and hoping to prevent in Hawaii.
Okay, the next question in the chat box. What is the most important thing that we can do to protect our islands, in your opinion?
I would say, well, I guess since the top two vectors are like ballast water and biofouling, probably just like managing those, like what our team does is pretty important, because like I said, there's so many species. Like I think I said it earlier, but there's like 346 species that have come in through ballast water biofouling. So like managing those and like cleaning your hull is very important.
Okay, and then the next question from the Q&A box. How has VITA changed your operation so far this year? Maybe that's more a question for Natalie.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So far, not a whole lot in terms of our operations, because so VITA is a complicated two-step process. So the act was passed in 2018. And then, as Sara mentioned, the EPA just came out with their proposed national standards of performance this past October, and that has to be finalized first. And then once those are finalized, it starts the clock for the US Coast Guard to create regulations to actually implement and enforce those standards. So that is slated to come into effect at the end of 2022. So that's when we expect our operations to change. In terms of what we've been doing so far, we've still been managing the ballast water in the same way that Sara mentioned with our risk assessments, or I guess prioritization matrix. And we've also been working with our partners. The CGAPS is Coordinating Group on Alien Pest Species, to provide comments to the EPA draft standards, and also working with the Coast Guard on state working groups to work with them and collaborate and kind of get ahead of the game.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. The last question from the chat box. What equipment is needed to capture fragments and paint from in-water cleaning?
So like one of the slides I showed is the in-water cleaning with capture. So they have like those ROVs, like those that can be like in the water, and they I guess they like capture all, like, to make sure like the discharge is not going into the surrounding waters. So I guess that can be used. Yeah. Natalie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so there are different kinds of technologies. They can be diver operated, like the pictures that Sara showed, or they can actually be remotely operated vehicles as well. They have different attachments like brushes, scrapers, and then they suction all that material off the hull. It then goes through a tube, a tether, I guess, and then it goes onto the shoreline, goes through a series of filters. And then depending on, again, the type of technology, it might go through additional treatment and then discharges the theoretically cleaned effluent into back into the harbor. Yeah.
Okay, I think that answers all the questions that we got. So again, I just want to thank Natalie and Sara for presenting and answering questions today. And I think I'm going to end the webinar here. So thank you guys. And thanks all our attendees for coming and learning with us. So, all right.
Great. Thanks, everyone.